The first lesson is from Jeremiah 2. Has a nation ever changed their gods? What wrong did your fathers find in me, that they went far from me and went after worthlessness and became worthless? They did not say, "Where is the Lord who brought us up from the land of Egypt, who led us in the wilderness, in a land of deserts and pits, in a land of drought and deep darkness, and a land that none passes through, where no man dwells? And I brought you into a plentiful land, to enjoy its fruits and its good things. But when you came in, you defiled my land, and made my heritage an abomination." The priests did not say, "Where is the Lord?" Those who handle the law did not know me. The shepherds transgressed against me. The prophets prophesied by Baal and went after things that do not profit. Therefore I still contend with you, declares the Lord, and with your children's children I will contend. For cross to the coasts of Cyprus and see, or send to Kedar and examine with care, see if there has been such a thing. Has a nation changed its God, even though they are no gods? But my people have changed their glory for that which does not profit. Be appalled, O heavens, at this. Be shocked, be utterly desolate, declares the Lord. For my people have committed two evils. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters, and hewed out cisterns for themselves, broken cisterns that can hold no water.
Our gospel lesson this day comes to us from the book of Luke. There in the gospel, in the 14th chapter, beginning at the first verse. On one occasion, when Jesus was going to the house of a leader of the Pharisees to eat a meal on the Sabbath, they were watching him closely. Just then, in front of him, there was a man who had dropsy. And Jesus asked the lawyers and the Pharisees, "Is it lawful to cure people on the Sabbath or not?" But they were silent. So Jesus took the man and healed him and sent him away. Then he said to them, "If one of you has a child or an ox that has fallen into a well, will you not immediately pull it out on a Sabbath day?" And they could not reply to this. When he noticed how the guests chose the places of honor, he told them a parable. "When you are invited by someone to a wedding banquet, do not sit down at the place of honor, in case someone more distinguished than you has been invited by your host. And the host who invited both of you may come and say to you, 'Give this place to this person.' And then in disgrace, you would start to take the lowest place. But when you are invited, go and sit at the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, 'Friend, move up higher.' Then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at the table with you. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted." He said also to the one who had invited him, "When you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends, or your brothers, or your relatives, or your rich neighbors, in case they may invite you in return, and you would already be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous." So end our lessons for this day. How did you learn about faith? How did you learn your beliefs, your ethics, your morals, your manners? I had an abnormal upbringing. I was a preacher's kid. So I had perfect attendance at Sunday school, went to every vacation church school, and sang in the church choir from kindergarten through 12th grade. And yet the place that we learned our faith and our ethics and our morals and our manners was not in Sunday school, and not in church choir, and not at vacation Bible school, but at the Sunday dinner table. I grew up with three brothers, and Despite our schedules, despite the schools changing so that we had staggered schedules where some started at 6 in the morning and some went to school till 6 in the evening, we made certain that every day we gathered together at the table. And on Sunday, there was always a tablecloth on the table, and we came home from church, and there was the good china and the good silver, and we all sat together. There were 8 years in which we did not make it through a meal without the milk being spilt. We learned to not belch. We learned to not kick our brothers under the table. We learned to say please and thank you. When we first came to Skaneateles, I recall at the candidating sermon describing that one of the great joys for me as a parent is taking my kids to school in the morning, and on the way home in the afternoons, that they would stop by the church to tell me about their day. And I recall one of the members of the congregation standing up to ask, so how many hours a week are you going to work if you're going to be taking your kids to school and having them stop by in the afternoons? I hope over the years you've gotten your money's worth and that I've worked enough hours in the day. But the reality is that those times, on the way to school, on the way home from school, and at the dinner table, are when we have honest communication, when we chat together and get to know each other and share what's important with us. In school, we're taught lessons and we recite back answers. On the football field, on the baseball diamond, in theater, we play roles. We are players who act out the lines and the plays that have been worked out for us. But in conversation, we stimulate each other, we ask questions of one another, and we get candid responses. One of the things that I'm most disappointed about in the coming fall is that Downton Abbey will not be played. And with that, there won't be those dining room tables at Downton Abbey, which, despite all the splendor and grandeur that was there, were honest, real conversations where one played off of another and stimulated the other to speak something that they hadn't intended to say. When we're stimulated by conversation, it often sparks an idea that we hadn't thought about to share with one another, and this is where our faith truly is revealed. In that passage that Gary read from us in the Revised Standard Version, it begins with a verse from Jeremiah. Hear, O Israel, O house of Jacob, the Lord our God. And anyone who is Jewish who'd heard that passage would immediately have known the passage that is said every day in our prayers. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one, and God only will you serve, with all your heart and mind and strength. That was the most basic piece, because the Egyptians and later the Greeks and the Romans all had multiple gods, many different kingdoms of gods, but Israel had one true God. But the difference here is that Jeremiah is saying there is only one true God, but you've been worshiping a number of other things as if gods. And with that, there's a subtle piece that Jeremiah offers to the people of faith, that you need to be careful about what it is that you worship, what it is that you believe in, because what you believe in becomes who you are. If you go after lusts, if you go after joys of the moment, that's all that you become. If you try to hide your secrets, all that you become about is darkness and hiding and secrecy. If you become about grief and about sorrow, then all you can become is grief and sorrow. But if you offer compassion to others, you become more compassionate. If you are a teacher teaching Sunday school to others, you learn more about your faith. In the things that we believe, in the ways in which we live our lives, this is who we become. It's what we practice. It's what we do in life that teaches us about what we believe and who we shall become. I've always been afraid of this passage from Jeremiah because several decades ago in another church, I don't remember preaching the sermon, but I remember Monday morning. We had a couple in the church who were extremely involved in the congregation. She was the clerk of session and sat on the session. She'd served for 6 different terms there. Her husband was the president of the deacons. Together they both sang in the choir. She'd started the church nursery school and she'd taught in it for 20 years. And on Monday morning she came in and said, "Your sermon affected us. We came home and talked about the sermon, and we decided that we'd been worshiping other gods. We'd been worshiping our house. We'd been worshiping our mortgage. And any time we received a windfall, any time we received a gift, it went towards the house. And there was one year in which, instead of a vacation, I gave my husband a new roof. And that year for an anniversary, he gave me a new kitchen. And everything about us has been about the house." And worst of all, we discovered that the word for mortgage actually in Latin means death. So we've decided we're going to sell our house. We're going to move away. We're going to travel the world and enjoy each other's company. And as their pastor, I had to be glad for them, but I also realized I was losing 2 choir members and an elder and a deacon and great leaders in the church and the nursery school. We got to be careful about what we preach because people are listening. People take it to heart, and they interpret in ways that we didn't always plan. That's what happens at the table. I think the greatest tragedy about our lives today is we've abandoned the dining room table. Houses today are being built without formal dining rooms. We don't have formal china or silver. We don't teach our manners and our faith by sitting at the table together. But the problem is that if you don't teach the story, if we don't recite the story on a regular basis, then other stories creep in instead. The people of Israel knew and understood that their earliest memory was that their ancestors were wandering nomads. They wandered the earth without a name, without a land, without any possessions, and God provided for them. Whatever they needed, God cared for them. And they were enslaved, and they were put into bondage, and they cried out to God, and God heard their prayers, and God cared, and God responded. The earth became corrupt. We followed our own sins and our own desires, and God could have destroyed everything. God almost did, but God saved a remnant. These are the precious stories of our faith. These are the stories that have been recited generation upon generation upon generation, and yet we don't do so anymore. We need to remember our stories and recite our stories and learn from them, because without those stories, other things fill their place instead. And we begin to say, whoever is strongest wins. Whoever has the most toys when they die wins. And life loses its meaning. Instead of about being about generosity, instead of about believing in God, instead of about believing that there is a God who cares for each and every one of us, we believe in nothingness and darkness, and we become dark, and we become nothing. Jesus was invited to dinner. And the most important part of that whole passage is that as he was invited to dinner, they were watching to see what he was going to do. So when he got to the dinner and the man in front of him had dropsy, Jesus healed him. It wasn't about the healing. It wasn't about the parables he taught. It wasn't about the sermons that he preached. It wasn't about the healings. They were watching and they were waiting for how they could catch him. And Jesus turned to them and said, "But if there's a child who's complaining, don't you want to take them to the nursery? If there's a baby who's fussing, wouldn't you respond to that? If your ox fell into a well, wouldn't you get it out? You'd just let it drown? Even on the Sabbath, you would respond to it." The difficulty is our technology is too much with us. In the time of Jeremiah, they invented something that had never been before. They had living water. They had streams and lakes that they could get their water from. but they created cisterns. A cistern had a smaller opening at the top and a larger bell shape down below, so that water could be channeled into it and rainwater would go into it, and the animals would not pollute it. And they could line the cistern with chalk or with lime, and it would naturally seal the water to keep impurities out. And then when the droughts came, they would have their own water. But the people began to believe in their cisterns that they could control, in the waters that they had, even though it was stagnant, rather than the living water. They began to believe in what they could control and who they were, apart from God. And they forgot everything that they believed. Jesus Christ is the Son of God. Jesus is the perfect atonement for all our sins. God gave this gift to us that we wouldn't be separate, that we wouldn't be divided, that we wouldn't dwell in our sins, but that we could be forgiven. That's a great gift. It's an incredible thing. And with that, all throughout the Gospels, Jesus is looking for the cross, for the point in which he will make that perfect atonement for us, and the resurrection of Easter. But the early church was different. The early church was all about the meal. In Jesus' time, there were a variety of different cultures. There were the Jewish people, there were the Greek people, there were the Roman people. And the Greeks didn't associate with the Romans, and the Jews didn't associate with either of the two as being uncircumcised Gentiles. However, within each culture, they had to be welcoming to any and all. So when you gave a celebration, you invited all the Jews, if you were Jewish, or you invited all the Gentiles, or you invited all the Greeks, or all the Romans. Except we sometimes didn't like all the people who were like us, and so we set up different tables. And some got to sit towards the front and have the best food, and some sat towards the back. Jesus Christ is and was the Son of God, the perfect atonement for our sins, the Messiah sent from God. But Jesus would have made a terrible, awful Presbyterian pastor. Can you imagine Jesus walking up the aisle as the pastors do on Sunday morning and saying, "You're sitting in the wrong seat. Go to the back. And come up front. You shouldn't be in the back. George, you always sit back there. Come on up front and sit." Can you imagine Presbyterians being told that they can't sit where they want to sit? The pastor wouldn't last. Jesus would have been crucified a lot sooner. But I would tell you a story that happened on my 10th anniversary with this congregation. Something the congregation wasn't planning on at all. That day we had a celebration of many different baptisms, many different children, and we had over 50 children in the sanctuary on that Sunday morning before Christmas. So it was that during the sermon we took one child and gave them to another family, and took a child from that family and gave them to a family on this side, describing that all week long you've put up with each other. All week long you've lived together and tried to love each other, and you come to worship God, and oftentimes you're saying, "Shh, be quiet, sit still, stand up straight." And that's only to your husband. So in worship, what we celebrated in baptism is that we claimed this child. Each of us did, not just that morning, but all of their lives. So let's take each other's child and sit with them in worship. The most amazing part of all of that was that with 50 children sitting with families that were not their own, there wasn't a whimper, there wasn't a cry in church, not from the mothers or the fathers or the children. You could have heard a pin drop as they comforted and cared for each other and worshiped God together. That's what the table is all about. What Jesus described for his disciples that we say at every different celebration of the sacrament is Jesus said, every time you take this bread, whenever you lift this cup, do so in remembrance of me. That's not just on the first Sunday of the month. It's not only on Christmas Eve and Easter morning, but at every meal. When you break bread, when you lift the cup, do so in remembrance of Jesus Christ.